Jason Unruhe is a political commentator who joins us from Ontario, and also Keith Preston, chief editor of AttackTheSystem.com, joins us from Richmond in order to get some analysis on this. Jason Unruhe, you have the China making statements saying that this is an affair that the U.S. should not be concerned about. So the question comes about why is the U.S. In a sense meddling in the affairs that is not related to the U.S. itself, and also criticizing human rights when the U.S. itself is suffering from that kind of violations within its own country?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the U.S. is going through its usual phase of trying to undermine China by creating, sometimes outright fabricating human rights abuses taking place in the country. I mean, this issue alone, aside from any criticism you may be able to make of China, it's very clear that this is a simple extradition treaty. Hong Kong is a part of China, and if you commit a crime in China, you should be able, if you're arrested in Hong Kong, you should be extradited back to face trial for your crime. I mean, the United States calls this an unfair targeting of individuals, but how is facing a trial unfair? But let's face the reality of this. The United States is essentially blowing this issue way out of proportion and even outright fabricating many aspects of it, is simply to undermine China itself. As we see from many of the imperialist powers, one of the moral high grounds they attempt to stand upon, because they don't stand on it very well, is to try to claim that other people are the human rights abusers, that they are the champions of freedom and democracy that everybody else is supposed to follow. And they do this by making a repeated denunciation of other countries on various issues, while frequently ignoring not just their own crime, but the crimes of countries that are allied to them, like Saudi Arabia or Israel, which are two of the worst human rights violators in the entire world. So this is purely a political move by the United States to try to demonize China in favor of their own foreign policy, particularly with regards to the current trade war that is taking place between the two countries. This is something that's very standard for the United States to do. There's nothing out of the ordinary here for them. It's fairly typical for them to take the domestic policy of many countries and use it as a criticism, when really just forwarding their own interest the entire time. Most likely what this is doing is essentially undermining the democratic process inside the country.
So if you can give us some background behind this, because one of the things that we hear about is the one country, two system, and also we hear about this agreement that U.S. has with Hong Kong, which it basically can deal with Hong Kong separate from China. How do those two figure in with what is happening?
Well, I would agree with virtually everything that the previous speaker said. He summarized what's happening in terms of U.S.-China relations fairly well. I would add to that there's an ongoing rhetorical battle between the United States and China over this question of human rights and things of that nature. It's certainly true that the actual law that's being passed in Hong Kong, whether you agree with it or not, is a simple extradition treaty. It's simply about being able to extradite fugitives from China, from Hong Kong, to China to face trial. The impetus behind the law was actually the fact that there was a fellow in China who had murdered his girlfriend. He was a fugitive and he had escaped to Hong Kong, and because there was no extradition agreement between Hong Kong and China, the Chinese were not able to extradite him. So this was actually the impetus behind this law. This is not a political case. But I think one thing that's happening now with the United States that I haven't really heard mentioned in the discussion of this issue is the fact that the United States has a case going on right now where they're trying to extradite an official, the chief financial officer, actually, of the Chinese telecom company, Huawei, in Canada. This individual, Meng Wanzhou, was detained by the Canadians in Vancouver, and she is a high-ranking executive at this at a major Chinese telecom company that the United States is currently targeting as part of its trade war with China. So this woman has been detained, and now the Americans are trying to extradite her to the United States on some charges that, at least from my reading of them, seem fairly dubious. But so I think that the Americans are trying to deflect attention away from this case. The Americans in recent times have greatly escalated their rhetorical hostility towards China. They've escalated this trade war. There's the case that's going on now in Canada where they have detained a high-ranking executive of a company they're specifically targeting. And I suspect that the Americans are concerned that the Chinese may use the extradition law in Hong Kong as a means of retaliation for this. It's possible, for example, that there are certainly Americans and American officials that could potentially be brought up on charges in China for various things. There's a lot of dealings between individuals and companies within the two countries. There's a lot of law breaking and so forth involved on both sides, as there always is. So I suspect that the Americans are afraid that American officials and representatives of American companies that have actually been involved in illegal activities in China could potentially be extradited more easily under this provision.
Very well. Thank you very much for that, Keith Preston, Chief Editor of AttackTheSystem.com. Jason Unruhe, thank you, political commentator from Ontario. And that does it for our news review.